Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. Over 180 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Episode 39, X-Man, Nate Gray. Today on the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show, we're going to be talking about an Omega-level mutant. It sounds very an Omega-level mutant that was created on an alternate Earth in the Marvel Universe. It was Earth 295 to be exact. And he ended up being such a popular character that he was sort of transported or brought over here to Earth 616 as things sort of shook out in that timeline. Again, it's a fairly convoluted origin, but today what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the mutant Nate Gray. So I have something to admit here. I've never really read a lot of X-Men titles, a lot of X titles. A little Claremont stuff, some stuff in the 90s. But I got to tell you, there were just so many titles, so many different X titles and characters that I just, I couldn't get into them. Again, in the late 80s and 90s, a little bit here and there. But again, there were just like a million X titles, and I sort of just, I just was never able to get into it. What I did read, I remember enjoying, but that's one of the things I enjoy about this podcast is that someone over on the Facebook page asked for Nate Gray. And I said, well, I told her I'm going to be doing a Nate Gray episode then. And what I enjoy about it is I then get to learn about a character that I know I've seen the comic book cover here and there, but I just never knew anything about him. I actually didn't even know what an Omega level mutant was, and we'll talk about that, of course, on the show. So, again, like I said, I love doing the show for this reason, to learn about characters and, of course, to explore, characters that I thought I remembered and ones that I still remember. I've got some really neat episodes coming up on all the characters from Preacher, because there's the TV show now too, and I'd forgotten so much stuff that it was exciting to do those. But let's not get started on those episodes. They're in the future. Let's talk about Nate Gray now. And again, this idea was given to me by someone over the Facebook page, so I want to thank you for shooting this over. Again, if you want to hear about a character, go over to Facebook and just search for, I think it's Facebook/Heroes, Villains, and Podcasts. I probably should have known that. But if you search for Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show, it'll pop up. Or, of course, head over to our website, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, and there you can, of course, leave me a message about a character you'd like to hear. That's always fun because then I can put your message in the show, and we can go ahead and play it. That's really fun. So let's go ahead. Let's get into Nate Gray. Now, this is one of those characters that doesn't really have a straight sort of forward origin. I guess he does, but it's the sort of world and timeline jumping that throws things off. So Nate Gray's origin starts on Earth 1, and it starts on one Earth and timeline and moves to another. But let's get the easy stuff out of the way. The character of Nathaniel Nate Gray was created for Marvel Comics by Jeff Loeb and artist Steve Crouch, and he first appeared in X-Men #1 in March of 1995. So it's one of those comics where, a lot of times you don't find the first appearance in the actual issue 1 of a character. Here you do. So, like I mentioned, Nate Gray was not actually born on Earth 616, the prime Earth of the Marvel Universe, where sort of all our characters that we know about are, Spider-Man and whatnot. He was actually born during what was called the Age of Apocalypse, during Marvel's Age of Apocalypse storyline. Now, what the Age of Apocalypse storyline is, and I hope I'm getting this right because I did some research on it, obviously, and read up quite a bit, but I didn't read these. It was a storyline that happened sort of outside our timeline, okay? The storyline is pretty much of an alternate timeline that was created by the super powerful and mentally unstable mutant named David Haller, a.k.a. Legion. Now, on a side note, if you haven't had a chance to watch the Legion show on FX, then you are missing probably one of the best superhero TV shows on TV right now. I mean, it is awesome. Again, I'm not a huge X-Men or mutant, reader, but it was incredible. I mean, the first season is on. I think it's on Hulu right now. I was blown away by it. I cannot wait for season 2. Actually, we'll have to do an episode on Legion. I just picked up his first appearance the other day, and I think I'm going to put him on the list. Well, let's get back to this. Age of Apocalypse. Legion decides he's going to do a whole go back in time and kill Hitler thing, but he decides that he's going to nip things in the bud and go back in time and kill Magneto before he becomes the big baddie of the mutant, our mutant Marvel universe. Now, unfortunately, he accidentally kills Professor X. Now, this sets in motion huge ramifications down the timeline and eventually leads Apocalypse to attack the Earth 10 years earlier than he did in the original timeline. Now, without Xavier and without the X-Men there to really a cohesive X-Men group to put up a fight, he takes control of the planet. Now, the X-Men do put up a fight, but they are defeated. And Apocalypse actually takes a firm control of North America. And of course, there's fighting going all over the world against him. But he has got a firm grip there, and he begins a sort of a genocidal campaign called the Cullings to kill humans, of course, which he feels are the dead weight, they're past, they're inferior. And he kills, in this timeline, millions upon millions of humans. Now, in this timeline, mutants are the ruling class, and Apocalypse, of course, is getting rid of these people. And he, of course, still has this horseman. Apocalypse created these horsemen you would probably guess, of the Apocalypse. And one of his elite horsemen, Mr. Sinister. And again, there's so many characters. If I went ahead and explained every single character and their background, this podcast would be like 4 hours long. But suffice to say, Mr. Sinister is sort of a general in Apocalypse's army. And he of course is vain, and he's a bad guy, and they don't usually play well together. And he chafes under his boss's rules, and he really wants to see him done away with. So he decides then to create a weapon, a very powerful weapon. So Sinister uses DNA from the Cyclops and Jean Grey, of course, of that timeline, because that's the only timeline there is there. There's that timeline, to create a super powerful mutant that isn't affected by what's called the technovirus that Apocalypse unleashed on the world to depower and cripple mutants so they couldn't stand against him. So this guy, this mutant, he doesn't have these dampeners put into him by this virus that kills and or just depowers. Now, Sinister names his new creation, his new child, Nate, after himself. Mr. Sinister's real name is Nathaniel Essex. So he sort of, does a little, Mr. Sinister Jr. with him. And there he is. He's created this child who is crazy, crazy powerful, really to the point where the power at one point is supposed to just sort of burn the child out after he sort of fulfills his destiny. But before Sinister could indoctrinate the boy into his schemes, Cyclops, of course, we're always talking about the X-Men and the characters of this alternate universe, never sort of our Cyclops. But so the Cyclops of this alternate timeline raids Sinister's lab and helps Nate escape. Of course, he doesn't even know that technically, he's saving his biological son. And Nate, he brings Nate to a camp, and he doesn't keep Nate. He doesn't know who he is, and Nate doesn't know who Cyclops is. So Nate ends up under the guidance of one of my favorite X characters, Forge. Now, I have always loved his abilities and powers. He's able to craft almost any machine or device imaginable. It's almost an empathic sort of way he can communicate with machines and their workings. And as someone who loves to build things, I build furniture, cosplay stuff, all kinds of things. I just always, I mean, his powers seem to be so cool. You know, you want to build something, this complex thing, or a table, or some cosplay outfit, you to be able to just do it and come up with it. And it isn't like he blinks his eyes or he snaps his fingers. He's able to create them, sometimes right out of just whole cloth, just making the bits and pieces. So that's Forge. I've always loved that character. So Forge senses the raw power in the boy, and it wasn't named yet in the Marvel U apparently, but Nate is what's called an Omega level mutant. This is the highest power level possible, and it's almost undefinable or immeasurable. You can't. It's capable of doing anything. But again, like I mentioned earlier, this power was also a danger to Nate, as the power someday would destroy himself, eating away at him till there was nothing left. And, you know, Mr. Sinister didn't really care so much about that. He just wanted this weapon. So Forge worked to teach the boy to be good and to use his powers wisely and to master his powers to sort of see what he could do. Now, as Nate matured, Mr. Sinister wanted to check up on him, and he, you know, found out where he was, and he infiltrated Forge's camp to see what was going on with the kid. But Sinister attacked, and he killed Forge. And when Nate attacked Sinister, Sinister let Nate read his mind, revealing to him what he was, how he was created, who he was, the exact levels of the power he had, and that he alone could destroy Apocalypse. Now, Nate then mortally wounds Sinister and then sets his sight on Apocalypse. The two battle, Apocalypse and Nate, and as they are fighting, the X-Men of that timeline are actually putting in place their final plan to destroy Apocalypse, to end him. And during Nate's fight with Apocalypse, the X-Men plan succeeds, and the false timeline begins to vanish from existence. Now, just as this is happening, another mutant, Holocaust, interrupts Nate's battle, and when Nate retaliates to fight off this other mutant, he unleashes a huge bolt of power, and both vanish just as the timeline is washing away, is being erased from history. And this is when Nate enters Earth Prime, or Earth 616. It's almost like, you know, the old timelines there, they wink out of existence as the timeline disappears. They're gone. Then the actual timeline sort of reestablishes itself, and they blink in, boom, they're on our Earth. It's like, what would be a good analogy? Oh, it's like yeah, that's a good one. You put, when you see someone have a magician, there's plates on a table, and then he pulls the cloth. So they're there, pull the cloth, they're up a little bit because the cloth moved, and then boom, they land on the table. I don't know if that was a great analogy. I don't even know if you needed one, but that's kind of what happened. So let's actually now, in his little origin here, let's take a break and talk about his actual power set. Because I've been saying things like, you know, a mega level mutant and, you know, powerful enough to kill Apocalypse and all this stuff. So what can he do? And I'll be honest with you, after reading and watching and going through some comics and watching some things here and there, it's almost like John Johns, the Martian Manhunter. I should list what he can't do, and it would be easier. But if we compare his powers actually to another character that a lot of people, especially people who read X-Men titles, have a sense of, it's been alluded to that he has more power than the Dark Phoenix, It's like when his mother is under the control of the Phoenix Force. This is like pretty much godlike power. Just, you know, your basics, Nate's able to read thoughts. Of course, he can control minds. He can also read thoughts off of objects that someone has held. He can create illusions, fire psychic blasts, and he can even leave his body and travel the astral plane. And that's just his psychic ability. And to make, you know, he can do this stuff over huge distances. I mean, he can do this across space. Like if someone was on the moon, and the moon is nothing. The moon would be like skipping a stone to him. He could control an astronaut's mind on the moon. That's how powerful he is. And again, that's just his psychic ability. He also is one of the planet's strongest telekinetic, and he has the ability to move massive objects, fire blasts that can shatter steel just with his mind. He can create shields. He can fly because he's pretty much just levitating himself or playing with the gravity of, or not the gravity, the gravitational forces that surround him. He can control the gravitational forces of the Earth. He can even use water. I read this thing. He's able to, and I've looked it up in the comics so I can see how he did it. Not how he did it, but he used water and like crystal sand, like the crystals in the sand, to create a hologram of himself that looked real. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, he could do pretty much anything. And usually when that happens, when you have a character like that, they end up getting depowered. And that happens. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, you would think that with all of this power, Nate would clean up in the 616, in our timeline, in now the reestablished normal timeline. But that's not the case. Now, even though the book is called X-Man, Nate spends very little time on the X-Men team, hardly any at all. Now, he does meet up with his alternate parents, Jean and Scott, and he battles. There's battles here and there with different groups. He ends up at one point trying to, in one of the battles, trying to save the planet. And he's fighting this huge bad guy, this major alien bad guy, and puts everything he has into destroying him. And of course, they both vanish, sort of almost like before, like he did. It was just this huge thing. And of course, everyone thinks he's dead. But remember, we are in comics, and he comes back. Not completely, not right away, not all together. He's sort of like in a disembodied, on the astral plane kind of thing. And after taking over some people's bodies, like Norman Osborn, during the whole one of those, when he had the fake X-Men team running, and he was in control of S.H.I.E.L.D. and everything, takes control of Norman Osborn. And then in the end, he's able to sort of manifest himself a body. So he is back. But here's the thing. Again, like I said, what they do a lot of times with characters that have godlike power, I mean, how do you put anybody up against him when really all he has to do is snap his fingers and you explode or you go insane, So even though he is severely depowered, he still learns to use his powers, what little he has left. He's still pretty powerful. I mean, he's nowhere near where he was or even where his mom is or Xavier is, but he's still a powerful telekinetic, and he can still read minds. And, he has a hard time controlling minds, but he works harder and harder to become the hero that he was, showing that even though he doesn't have godlike powers, he can still fight with the best of them. So again, this was a fun one. There were so many characters and so many people that I could have put in these origins that he bumped into and met along the way, but I really wanted to focus on the core of it, like who he was, how he was created. Again, some people, there's a whole thing with this character that some people think that he is technically they think he's the Cable from the alternate universe, but he, from the alternate timeline, but he isn't. That's been said. He is not the Cable from the alternate universe. And I'll be honest with you, in not having a huge background in these characters, it was a little confusing at first, but now to see okay, this was an alternate timeline. He came here, and this is who he was. And I love the idea of having this immensely powerful being come here. And I reread some of these. I looked through some trades that a friend had, and it has that whole fish out of water thing, which was fun, because here he is in this alternate Earth where mutants are superior and ruthless. And then he comes here and, mutants are treated like garbage. And of course, the whole reality is completely different. So some of those are kind of fun. But it was an interesting podcast to research. And I'm really glad that someone over on Facebook said, hey, I'd like to hear about Nate Gray. Well, I want to thank you for listening to the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. If you want to hear about a character, again, head over to Facebook and leave a message, or go over to the website and you can record a message, a voice message, and we can listen to it. Again, if you want to see some cool images and some video clips and whatnot, go over to the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, and there I'll have pages from a lot of the issues and a lot of the events that I'm talking about here on the podcast, and it's like that for all of the podcasts. If you want to see some pages or some really cool clips that I might be able to find online about any of the shows, they're right over there, just heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, and then the episodes page. Well, again, I want to thank you for listening. I had a lot of fun recording this episode. We'll be back with more next week. I'm Kevin Volo. This is the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show. Take care.